Today is April 16, 2017. We are in the midst of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and today, being the day following the seventh-day Sabbath within the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it is the day of the offering of the wave sheaf. So before we get into our study, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Heavenly Family, thank you so much for this message. Thank you for the truth. Thank you for showing us a new and better way. Thank you for directing us to understand some of what you are doing in the heavens for our sake here on earth. Thank you for teaching us the principles that we've been learning in this message, and please rid us of every bit of error. Flood our minds with truth. And Sister, please guide us through this particular study. Help us all to have a clear conception of what you want to communicate to us, and help me to convey the things you've been teaching us in the clearest way possible. Toda, thank you. We ask this b'Shem Tzemach. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Toda.
So, I've been praying about what we should be going through in this study and all of that, because, Wave Sheaf Day is definitely significant. And as branches especially, we've always understood and taught that the wave sheaf ceremony is very, very important. And the whole purpose of the Davidian movement is to produce a wave sheaf of people. And the idea of that, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows, or at least probably most people, if there's anyone who just came on who is new to the message or hasn't been on many meetings, perhaps it is new. But one of the foundational teachings of the branch message is that the salvation of souls in the last days will be accomplished in a manner similar to the harvest of produce throughout a year, of course, based on the harvest in Palestine. And there are various harvest rites or harvest rituals as commanded by Yahweh in the law of Moses, which have certain prophetic significances that have always been important to us as branches. And so, for instance, there are three main harvest rites in the book of Leviticus. The first is the wave sheaf offering. The second is the wave loaves offering. And the third is the celebration of the completion of the harvest during the Feast of Tabernacles. And the wave sheaf offering is the first portion of grain that has been ripened. And this took place in the spring of the year. And, of course, the offering of the wave sheaf took place on the day following the seventh-day Sabbath, which falls within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so, seeing that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a 7-day feast, there's always only one seventh-day Sabbath within that feast, and the wave sheaf is to be offered on the day after that seventh-day Sabbath.
So it could fall outside of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, like it did the last 2 years.
That's right. The last 2 years, the seventh-day Sabbath during the feast was on the seventh, in other words, the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and therefore the offering of the wave sheaf actually took place on the day after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, but what we've understood is that that offering of a grain signifies the beginning of the harvest. In the land of Israel, prior to that wave sheaf offering, leading up to Passover time, there would be the quote-unquote latter rains. And the latter rain would fall, and it was a lighter rain, and it would mature the grain, ripening it for the harvest. Of course, it's the latter rain because earlier in the fall, there was the early rain. So all of these various plants would be planted in the fall, and the rain, the early rain would come and kind of initiate their growth. And then in the spring, there would be the latter rains, which would bring about the final stages of their growth to be ready to be harvested. And the first grain that was ready to be harvested was barley. And so the wave sheaf offering was of barley grain. And what would happen is someone would bring a small amount of barley and an omer, well, really it's a measurement of grain. An omer of barley would be brought, and then the priest would take a handful of that omer and offer it on the altar. So that the amount that was offered on the altar is just a portion of that omer of grain, or sheaf of grain, if you will, although omer is a far better translation because it's a specific measurement of grain rather than,
stalks of grain.
Stalks of grain, exactly. So that would be offered, and that was the first part of the harvest. And then after that, people were able to use the grain of the harvest. And we'll go back and read the passage dealing with the wave sheaf, but I want to do a brief overview first. So before the wave sheaf was offered, no one was supposed to gather any other grain, and no one was supposed to make bread and eat the grain and all that. The first part of it, which is why it's called a first fruits offering, the first part of it was taken and offered to God. Only after that could people eat the grain of the new harvest. So, as the next 50 days went on, another harvest, if you will, or another grain became ready to harvest, and that is the wheat. And at the end of the 50 days, the wheat harvest was drawing to completion, and there would be 2 wave loaves, in other words, 2 loaves of bread baked with leaven of wheat, and they would be offered 50 days after the wave sheaf was offered. And that feast upon which the wave loaves were offered is what Christians typically call Pentecost, and Jews call it Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. Penta meaning 50. So on the 50th day, or the Feast of Weeks, because there are 7 weeks leading up to that day, and there's that offering. And then in the 7th month of the year, there is the Feast of Tabernacles, with a celebration of the final ingathering of all the grain and the grapes and whatever other produce. So that's all part of the harvest. The Temple Scroll, of course, has more harvest festivals, and I'm thinking we will be talking about that sometime soon, probably not today. But the 3 main ones that we are aware of are the wave sheaf, the wave loaves and the Feast of Tabernacles celebration. So you have these 3 harvest festivals. Well, what we've understood in the Davidian movement is that the harvest of grain and even grapes is a symbol of the harvest of souls, as in people being brought into the kingdom of God. In looking at the days of Jesus and the early apostles, it's apparent that some of the significant events that took place during their time took place on these harvest festivals. So, for instance, the day upon which Jesus rose from the dead was this day, a little less than 2,000 years ago. This day being the day of the wave sheaf offering. That's the day upon which he rose from the dead. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, and this is also implied in Revelation, and there's also a reference in Ephesians and a reference in the Odes of Solomon. He also had others raised with him. And what we've understood is that Christ and those who rose with him were the antitypical wave sheaf. In other words, that offering of grain was really just a symbol for an offering of people being presented before God. And we understand that Jesus brought in a new priestly system, not the Levitical, but the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So with that in mind, we can see that in the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, the offering on these days, the harvest festivals, was not an offering of grain, but an offering of people being presented before God as acceptable. So Jesus is called the first fruits of them that slept by Paul, and he was the wave sheaf, the first portion of the saints, being raised from the dead, glorified, and presented before God. So that was a wave sheaf, if you will. And then 50 days after the resurrection, there's a significant event on the day of Pentecost where you had 2 groups of people, the 120 and the 3,000, who parallel the 2 loaves of bread offered on the day of Pentecost in the Levitical service. And they were presented before God full of the Spirit of truth. So, leavened, yes. So they are an antitypical grain offering, just as were Jesus and those who rose with him. And then there was 3.5 years after the resurrection of Jesus, there was a significant Feast of Tabernacles. At that time, the gospel went to the Gentiles. This is about the time of the stoning of Stephen. And there are other things besides what we have in the book of Acts that tie that together, but I won't go into that now. And there's also, according to the Apocryphon of James, or the hidden book of James, a significant Feast of Tabernacles the year after the crucifixion and resurrection. And so, there's these harvest events being fulfilled with people rather than with grain. And what Victor Hodeff pointed out, and what Ben and Lois expanded on to a significant degree, is the fact that in these latter days, there's to be a harvest of souls, And there is to be a wave sheaf who will not taste death, just like there was a wave sheaf of those who did taste death. So there's to be an initial portion offered to God. And that's typically how we have understood the antitypical significance of the wave sheaf offering, and that is certainly a correct understanding of it. However, last year on the wave sheaf day, we discussed the fact that there appears to be another element to this offering, and it kind of comes through in reading what Leviticus 23 has to say concerning this offering. So I'll go to that now. This starts in Leviticus 23, verse 9. Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you enter the land that I am about to give to you, and you gather in its harvest, then you must bring an omer of the first portion of your harvest to the priest, and he must wave the omer before Yahweh to be accepted for your benefit. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest is to wave it." Of course, this is in the context of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is in the preceding verses. So there is a Sabbath called the Sabbath within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Of course, it must be the seventh-day Sabbath because that is the only Sabbath referred to as the Sabbath. And if it's not referring to the seventh-day Sabbath, it's really ambiguous because there's two festal Sabbaths connected with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And one would be just as justified to say that it is one or the other. Oh, well, this is after the Sabbath. Oh, that's after the last Sabbath. Oh, no, that's after the first Sabbath. Well, if it was either of them, it would have specified it's the seventh-day Sabbath, and the Feast of, or the wave sheaf offering, rather, is offered the day following that. Continuing on in verse 12. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must also offer a flawless yearling lamb for a burnt offering to Yahweh, along with its grain offering, 2/10 of an ephah of choice wheat flour mixed with olive oil, as a gift to Yahweh, a soothing aroma, and its drink offering, 1/4 a hin of wine. You must not eat bread, roasted grain, or fresh grain until this very day, until you bring the offering of your God. This is a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all the places where you live. Okay, so what we've found in terms of the observance of the ceremonial law in antitype is that there is a prophetic aspect to it where there are specific events pointed to that are fulfilled. But then there's also the practical every day, every week, every month, every year keeping of the law in its antitypical setting. So, for example, in Mark, we're told that Jesus was put on the cross on the third hour of the day and that he died at the 9th hour. Well, hey, those are the times of the morning and evening sacrifice. So Jesus fulfilled the morning and evening sacrifice. Yet, throughout the New Testament, in Acts, in the writings of Paul, in 1 Corinthians, for example, and elsewhere, the daily sacrifice is spoken of as still significant and is kept in the keeping of the suppers of the Lord each day at the 3rd and 9th hours. So you have the prophetic element where there's a significant event that took place at those times and fulfilled the type, but then you have the practical observance of the law, which calls to mind the prophetic event that was fulfilled. So it's quite important to realize that there are both aspects. And so far, until last year, in the branch movement, really there has been more of a focus just on the prophetic element. However, there were in Los Rodas days somewhat of an annual observance of the wave sheaf offering, where on the day of the wave sheaf offering, Lois would pray for the people and especially new believers and stuff like that, and would in a sense wave them before God as an offering. And this idea is, okay, well, there are new people in the message. These are the ones who are just being harvested, and let's offer them to God. And they are, as it were, a token, a guarantee of those to yet be brought in this new year's harvest. So last year, Teresa and I prayed specifically for the new people coming in, and as it were, presented them before God. And this year we did the same thing at the third hour, the morning daily. And there's an element like that involved in the keeping of the wave sheaf offering and antitype. However, we don't understand all of the elements of it. You know, as you noticed, I'm sure, when I read this passage, there's supposed to be the offering of a flawless yearling lamb, a lamb of the first year, and it's a burnt offering. It has a grain offering with it, and it's mixed with olive oil, the grain offering is, and there's a drink offering. Well, we don't understand all of how that is to be fulfilled yet. But there's an element last year that we talked about with this, how one of the things that it says, right in the last verse, verse 14, of this description of the wave sheaf offering, is the idea that we must not eat bread, roasted grain, or fresh grain until this very day. Well, obviously, in context, if people are supposed to keep this year after year, it doesn't give a starting point from, oh, you just shouldn't eat bread now, from this point, up until the wave sheaf day. So that implies that what it must be referring to is simply not eating the grain of the new harvest. You may have grain from the old harvest, which there's no restriction of eating, since there's no command to only eat it up till a certain point. But this is talking about the new harvest of grain, and no new grain is to be eaten until that day.
Another indicator for that being true is the very fact that there's the command during the Feast of Unleavened Bread to be eating unleavened bread.
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, that shows for sure that it's not like they were to abstain from eating bread altogether. No, they were commanded to be eating bread, unleavened bread, but clearly that bread was not from the grain of the new harvest. That was from the previous year's harvest. But this is the new harvest, and they aren't supposed to eat that grain until that point. And this is kind of interesting because, well, what does that mean if the grain represents people? What does it mean to, quote-unquote, eat the people? Seems like a rather odd symbol. However, not totally unheard of. I mean, Jesus talked about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And, of course, those are symbols for having his words abiding in us. And so, perhaps there's a sense of, the people who are coming in being able to participate in something where they contribute their words or something along those lines. Like, we don't know exactly how this comes about yet, but that's, there is a way in which that element could be fulfilled with people. But we also know that grain, in addition to being a symbol for people, is a symbol for truth. And in our studies in the book of Revelation, particularly Revelation chapter 14, we found that there's this harvest from verses 14 on. Really, the harvest starts in verse 16. And there's first a grain harvest and then a grape harvest. Well, what we found is that the fulfillment of that in terms of people being harvested has not yet met its perfect fulfillment. Yet there was a fulfillment of that prophecy, and which is still ongoing, through the harvesting of truth that will ultimately bring in the harvest of people. And so what we've seen is that there are passages where there's this double application of harvest of people and harvest of truth. And there seems to be this element with the Wave Sheaf Day where there's new truth to be had in the new year. And up until the Wave Sheaf Offering Day, when that truth is presented before the Lord, prior to that time, people are not supposed to eat of the new grain, the new truth. But after that point, there's this new harvest of truth. And yet, I will say that, of course, in order for that grain to be ready to be offered on the Wave Sheaf Day, there is an outpouring of rain, or at least a sprinkling of rain, the Spirit of truth coming upon the grain in order to ripen it to be offered, which implies that there's some sort of outpouring of the Spirit in order to manifest or to prepare the truth of that that new harvest of truth, in order for people to start eating of it, if you will, in that new year. So there's a lot to this that is still unknown, and I'm sure that this year's, before I say this, I'll mention something that is in essence the same principle. In the history of the Advent movement so far, our Heavenly Family has revealed different elements of how to keep their law. And as they reveal different elements, people have been commanded to keep those elements. But not everything is yet revealed, so things end up being kept somewhat imperfectly. So, for instance, the Sabbath was revealed, and the Advent people who accepted it knew, yes, we are supposed to keep the Sabbath. But they didn't know everything about the Sabbath, and so they didn't keep it from sunset to sunset as the Scripture teaches. They kept it from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock for 10 years. So they had a revelation, and they walked in it with the light that they had, but there was imperfection in their observance. And finally, our Heavenly Family revealed, and by the way, it's actually from sunset to sunset, not from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So it was a correction, and they had to have that correction. But here's the thing. If they had never kept the Sabbath to begin with, even imperfectly, they never would have been corrected on how to keep it. Same thing with the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is something that the Advent people kept for a long time, in a manner of speaking. But then under the branch message, our Heavenly Family showed, hey, you know, and even in the branch message, it's kind of interesting because at first there was the keeping of the times of prayer, 3rd and 9th hour. And it wasn't even connected with the Lord's Supper yet. So there's an element that is connected to the Lord's Supper, and it was brought in, and the Adventist Church was keeping a corrupt version of the Lord's Supper at the same time. So you have these things disconnected from each other. But our Heavenly Family was okay with that because they're taking people along a process. And then, you know, at first when the times of prayer were revealed, well, 3rd and 9th hour, all these historians and everything always generalize and say, oh, that's 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Okay, so it's kept at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Well, that's not quite right. That's not actually the 3rd and 9th hour, because even if you go with the generalization of 6 to 6, it's not 9 and 3, it's 8 and 2 as the starting times. So you have the first hour from 6 to 7, the second hour from 7 to 8, and the third hour from 8 to 9. So 9 and 3 are actually the ending of those hours. And so there was however long that the branch movement kept these hours of prayer at 9 and 3, when really, to keep it more accurately, it would have to be at 8 and 2, leading up to 9 and 3. And then, at some point, our Heavenly Family brought to view the fact that saying 8 and 2 is really a generalization based off of 6 o'clock, rather than going from sunrise to sunset and dividing the day into its natural periods, according to the rising and setting of the sun. And so that's an element that Doug emphasized. And so that was further correction. And then the element of the Lord's Supper being connected to the dailies, and washing away all this rubbish of the mass-type mock meal sort of thing that had become the Lord's Supper, instead of having it just being a genuine meal. But you see that that's a long progression of things. But it was important for people each step of the way to keep what had been given to them in order to be enabled to be corrected and to keep the rest. So most often our Heavenly Family does not reveal just a full, complete system with everything just totally set and then tell us to keep it. Because usually people don't keep it like that. I mean, even the sacrificial service was not given like that. I mean, sure, you have a huge revelation of a bunch of light at the same time under Moses, but that wasn't the beginning of light on the sacrificial service. You had some light given throughout the patriarchal period and so on, and, you know, here's a bit on sacrifices, and then, okay, well, here's this tabernacle service. Wow, that's a whole lot of light. But even then, there were some things that were added as you went during the wilderness period. It wasn't all given boom in one shot. And then after that, in the days of David, he instituted an extra element to the temple services, if you would call it that, even though it's still tabernacle in the days of David. And that was music. That was not part of it up till that point. And then, under the reign of Solomon, you have the building of the temple, which more fully manifests this law. And then, of course, Ezekiel prophesied of another temple, and so on and so forth. And you have a progressive revelation of the ceremonial law throughout the history of the children of Israel. And so it was not kept in fullness at these various points. They had to keep it a certain way for a while, and then they were given a fuller revelation. So that's how it is with this, and what our Heavenly Family wants to draw our attention to today is still, in a sense, viewed through a glass darkly, if you will. It's not altogether clear. There are elements of this that I don't understand how to keep in all of its details. But I'll share with you what our Heavenly Family has showed us, and it may greatly benefit some of you. And what I will mention also is that, just like with the wave sheaf offering, the omer of grain that is brought to the priest is just a portion of what had actually ripened. Rain had been falling on all the grain. And this was just a portion that was offered. And so it is today. So I'm sure as we go through these various feasts, these various wave sheaf days, progressively, that we will learn to keep them more and more fully, and our Heavenly Family will show us how. And the offering, the presentation of truth today, actually relates in principle to being able to keep even the wave sheaf offering better, even though it's not about the wave sheaf offering. But it is about the practical observance of the antitypical priestly law. And so that's what we will be getting into. So, what we are going to be talking about is a subject found in Numbers 6. Does anyone know here what the primary subject of Numbers 6 is?
We don't know.
Okay. That's always a wonderful thing to say, right? Okay, don't know. I always enjoy saying I don't know when I just don't know something. But I'm just saying, I appreciate you mentioning it just so that there's not a long silence with no feedback. So, the primary subject of number 6 is the Nazarite vow. And our Heavenly Family has been sprinkling on the Nazarite vow for a while, and on more than the Nazarite vow, but the Nazarite vow is what our Heavenly Family has put on me to bring up. Now, before getting into this, first I have to distinguish between two things. First is the idea of a Nazarite, and the next is the idea of a Nazarene. These are very different things. A Nazarite, the Naz, the letter in Hebrew is a Zayin, which makes the Z sound, and the Z sound of Nazarene, if you've heard me say it in Hebrew before, it's actually Netzarim, which is more like a TS sound, which is a different Hebrew letter called a Tzadeh, and it makes the TS sound. And so they're based off of different roots. They don't mean the same thing. Often people think, oh, Jesus was a Nazarene. Well, yeah, he was a Nazarene, but people often think, oh, well, that means he had, long hair and all these other things that are part of the Nazarite vow. But no, it's a very different thing. Jesus was not a Nazarite. We know this because he was accused of being a wine bibber, for instance. He drank grape juice. Nazarites were commanded not to drink grape juice. And So that shows automatically he was not actually a Nazarite, but he was a Nazarene. He was the branch. And so netzer is the singular form of netzarim. So netzarim is branches. Netzer is branch. And in Isaiah 11, among other passages, the Messiah is referred to as the netzer, or the branch. Nazarite is something different. Nazar has to do with being consecrated, being separated or consecrated, and we'll talk about it some more, but it's really a consecration vow. So that's the first thing, just to separate that, because I figure it's a question that is common to come up when talking about Nazarites and Nazarenes. People think that they're the same, but they're really not the same. So what we're looking at is a different thing. It's a specific vow, and this is embedded within the priestly system, but it has some peculiarities. There are some things about the Nazarite vow which are very different in the priestly system. It's unique in some ways. So I'm going to start with just reading the majority of Numbers 6, which is Numbers 6 verses 1 to 21, which is the section dealing with the Nazarite vow. The rest of Numbers 6 has to do with the Aaronic blessing, the priestly blessing. We won't read that because it's a separate subject. So bless us, Heavenly Family, as we read this passage. Give us as much understanding of this as you see fit, and as you see us fit for. So make us fit. Thank you. Verse 1. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when either a man or a woman takes a special vow to take a vow as a Nazarite, to separate himself to Yahweh, he must separate himself from wine and strong drink. He must drink neither vinegar made from wine nor vinegar made from strong drink. Nor may he drink any juice of grapes, nor eat fresh grapes or raisins. All the days of his separation he must not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, from seed to skin. All the days of the vow of his separation no razor may be used on his head, until the time is fulfilled for which he separated himself to Yahweh. He will be holy, and he must let the locks of his hair on his head grow long. All the days that he separates himself to Yahweh, he must not contact a dead body. He must not defile himself, even for his father or his mother or his brother or his sister if they die, because the separation for his God is on his head. All the days of his separation he must be holy to Yahweh. If anyone dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, then he must shave his head on the day of his purification. On the seventh day he must shave it. On the eighth day he is to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest, to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then the priest will offer one for a purification offering and the other as a burnt offering. and make atonement for him because of his transgression in regard to the corpse. So he must consecrate his head on that day. He must rededicate to Yahweh the days of his separation and bring a male lamb in its first year as a reparation offering. But the former days will not be counted because his separation was defiled. Now, this is the law of the Nazarite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he must be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and he must present his offering to Yahweh, one male lamb in its first year without blemish for a burnt offering, one ewe lamb in its first year without blemish for a purification offering, one ram without blemish for a peace offering, and a basket of bread made without yeast, cakes of fine flour mixed with olive oil, wafers made without yeast and smeared with olive oil, and their grain offering and their drink offerings. Then the priest must present all these before Yahweh and offer his purification offering and his burnt offering. Then he must offer the ram as a peace offering to Yahweh, and the basket of bread made without yeast. The priest must also offer his grain offering and his drink offering. Then the Nazarite must shave his consecrated head at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and must take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire where the peace offering is burning. And the priest must take the boiled shoulder of the ram, one cake made without yeast from the basket, and one wafer made without yeast, and put them on the hands of the Nazarite after he has shaved his consecrated head. Then the priest must wave them as a wave offering before Yahweh. It is a holy portion for the priest, together with the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the raised offering. After this, the Nazarite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazarite who vows to Yahweh his offering according to his separation, as well as whatever else he may provide. Thus, he must fulfill his vow that he makes according to the law of his separation. Okay. This is the law of the person who takes a Nazarite vow. There are a couple things I'm going to mention about it, and then I want to talk about a couple other passages before returning to this. First, it is worth noting that there are 3 restrictions placed on an individual taking a Nazarite vow. Also worthy of note is the fact that the individual can be male or female. It's not just a male thing. Males and females can participate in the Nazarite vow. It doesn't say much in terms of what the Nazarite is to do. In fact, there's nothing specific that he is to do other than at the end, when he has completed the days of his separation, then he is supposed to bring certain offerings and offer his hair on the altar. But during the Nazarite vow, there's nothing that he is commanded to actually do. There are only things that he is commanded to abstain from. First, he is to abstain from all grape products. Second, he is to abstain from cutting his hair, which is to say he is to let his hair grow long. Notice, though, that that is not something he is to do. It's not like an action that he must perform. It's something that he is supposed to abstain from doing. a person can do nothing and their hair will grow. So it's not like, oh, you are to take this and do that and so on and so forth. It's actually refraining from a common activity rather than doing an uncommon activity. So he's to abstain from grape products, abstain from cutting his hair on his head. And thirdly, he is to abstain from contact with the dead. The most common time someone would contact the dead is if their family members were to die. And then they would, prepare the body for burial and bury the body. But he is to abstain from doing that. It does not specify the period of time the Nazarite vow must last, which implies that maybe a Nazarite could vow for different periods of time. One individual might vow to be a Nazarite for a certain length of time, someone else for another length of time. We know that there is also some lifelong Nazarites, such as Samson and Samuel, as we will see. Also, it does imply that at least one way to vow a Nazarite vow is to give a specific period of time. Let's say someone wanted to vow for, whatever, let's just say 200 days they were going to keep this Nazarite vow. Well, let's say 100 days in, they come in contact with a corpse, a dead body. Well, now it says that those days do not count for them, the first 100 days, because their head was defiled. Now notice, it said that they are not supposed to touch a dead body because of their consecrated head. So the focus is on the head. And then it said that they are to keep their head holy. Again, the focus is on the head. At the end, they shave their head and offer their hair on the altar. Now that's very unusual. Offering hair on the altar? What's that about? Human hair. Very interesting. So the hair, in essence, is the offering. That's the part that's consecrated, that's made holy, and so on. So we'll return to these aspects, but I wanted to just outline these basic elements and recount them or recap them just so that they're clear in everyone's mind. This is what it says. These are the stipulations for the Nazarite vow. Of course, if a Nazarite was to come in contact with a dead body during the duration of their vow, there are things which they must do in order to restart their vow. They have to bring sacrifices, they have to be cleansed, and there are other things, other details which I won't mention quite yet. And then at the end, there are sacrifices which they are supposed to do, and that's all very important and very significant. But just to get a basic idea of the vow itself and the stipulations of the vow. Okay, so that's all good and important to keep in mind. And right now, by the way, we're just focusing on the type, just trying to get an idea of what an ancient Nazarite vow was like. And then, obviously this is the way it must work. Since the antitype is based on the type, we first have to understand some of what the type has to say before we can relate it to how it applies in a different system. So, there are two other passages that I want to look at in regard to the Nazarite vow. Two other primary passages, at least. The first is Judges 13. This has to do with the birth of Samson. So this is what it says, starting at verse 1, Judges 13. The children of Israel again did evil in Yahweh's sight. So Yahweh handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. There was a man named Manoah from Zorah, from the Danite tribe. His wife was infertile and childless. Yahweh's messenger appeared to the woman and said to her, "You are infertile and childless, but you will conceive and have a son. Now, be careful. Do not drink wine or beer, and do not eat any food that will make you ritually unclean." Now, actually, some other translations have, "Do not consume wine or beer or grape." So don't have that, and don't do anything that will make you unclean. "Look, you will conceive and have a son. You must never cut his hair, for the child will be dedicated to God." Now, the word for dedicated here is Nazir or Nazir. Nazir, that's the word to dedicate or to consecrate. That is the root word for the Nazarite. A Nazarite is a dedicated one or a consecrated one. Nazir is to dedicate or to consecrate. So the child will be dedicated or Nazarited even to God from birth. He will begin to deliver Israel from the power of the Philistines. Now it continues on. The woman went, this is verse 6, the woman went and said to her husband, "A man sent from God came to me. He looked like God's messenger. He was very awesome," or his appearance was very awesome. "I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell me his name. He said, 'Look, you will conceive and have a son. So now do not drink wine or beer, and do not eat any food that will make you ritually unclean. For the child will be dedicated," again, Nazir or Nazarited, "to God from birth till the day he dies." Okay, so now you have, he's to be a Nazarite from birth to the day he dies. So he's a lifelong Nazarite. Now, this goes on, and it repeats some of this stuff again. I'm going to go down to verse 13, just for sake of time, without reading the whole thing. So Yahweh's messenger now appears to Manoah and says, "Your wife should pay attention to everything I told her. She should not drink anything that the grapevine produces." So notice, not just wine and beer, but not anything that the grapevine produces. And actually the word there for drink in Hebrew is eat. That's very important to realize. So earlier, the angel told her, "Do not drink wine or beer." And now in verse 14, the messenger speaking to Manoah says, "She should not eat anything that the grapevine produces. She must not drink wine or beer, and she must not eat any food that will make her ritually unclean. She should obey everything I command her to do." And then Manoah basically makes a sacrifice.
What verse was that again?
Verse 14.
Judges 13:14?
Yeah. So that's giving the basic idea of what was to take place with Samson. And then, of course, we know the story of Samson. And he ends up, of course, doing things wrong and getting his hair cut and all of that. But notice, this is described using this word, Nazir. He's dedicated. He has to grow his hair long. But look how it's different from Numbers. In Numbers, an individual vowed to consecrate themselves. And in vowing to consecrate themselves, they had to abstain from any grape products. They had to abstain from cutting their hair. And they had to abstain from coming in contact with the dead, which serves to make them unclean. Now, this one doesn't, in Judges, it doesn't mention anything about the dead. It mentions something about not eating food that will make you unclean. So that's a difference between them. But it's quite interesting how in one circumstance, in Numbers 6, it's just one individual, and all of these 3 restrictions are upon the same individual, and they dedicated themselves. Whereas here, it's the mother that is dedicating or Nazariting the child, and the stipulations are divided between them. Samson was to have his hair grow long. But she, the mother, she was supposed to abstain from grape products and from the unclean. So that's quite interesting. So, what's that about? What does that indicate to us? And so we'll get to that. But first I want to go to another passage. And this is 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah. He was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of the first was Hannah, and the name of the second was Peninnah. Now, Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. Year after year, this man would go up from his city to worship and to sacrifice to Yahweh of hosts at Shiloh, because, of course, that's where the tabernacle was. It was there that the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, served as Yahweh's priests. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he used to give meat portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But he would give a double portion to Hannah because he especially loved her. Now Yahweh had not enabled her to have children. Her rival wife used to upset her and make her worry, for Yahweh had not enabled her to have children. Peninnah would behave this way year after year. When Hannah went up to Yahweh's house, Peninnah would upset her so that she would weep and refuse to eat. Finally, her husband, Elkanah, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep and not eat? Why are you so sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" On one occasion in Shiloh, after they had finished eating and drinking, Hannah got up. Now, at the time, Eli the priest was sitting in his chair by the doorpost of Yahweh's temple. As an interesting side note, it is very interesting that it calls this a temple, even though the temple had not yet been built. This is pre-Solomon. Anyways, verse 10. She was very upset as she prayed to Yahweh, and she was weeping uncontrollably. She had made a vow, saying, "O Yahweh of hosts, if you will look with compassion on the suffering of your female servant, remember me and not forgetting your servant, and give me or give a male child to your servant. Then I will dedicate him to Yahweh all the days of his life. His hair will never be cut. So, of course, that sounds quite familiar. Now, continuing on, verse 12. As she continued to pray to Yahweh, Eli was watching her mouth. Now Hannah was speaking from her heart. Although her lips were moving, her voice was inaudible. Eli therefore thought she was drunk. So he said to her, How often do you intend to get drunk? Put away your wine. But Hannah replied, That's not the way it is, my lord. I am under a great deal of stress. I have drunk neither wine nor beer. Rather, I have poured out my soul to Yahweh. Don't consider your servant a wicked woman, for until now I have spoken from my deep pain and anguish. Eli replied, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request that you have asked him. She said, May I, your servant, find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and got something to eat. Her face no longer looked sad. They got up early the next morning, and after worshiping Yahweh, they returned to their home at Ramah. Elkanah had marital relations with his wife Hannah, and Yahweh remembered her. After some time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, thinking, I asked Yahweh for him. Verse 21. This man, Elkanah, went up with all his family to make the yearly sacrifice to Yahweh and to keep his vow. But Hannah did not go up with them. Instead, she told her husband, Once the boy is weaned, I will bring him and appear before Yahweh, and he will remain there from then on. Now, something that I must point out that's very, very interesting. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, that verse, verse 22, the one I just read, reads a bit differently. Part of it is missing, part of it is fragmentary. But there's a line that's missing from the Masoretic text, but it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is what it says. I'll just read verse 22.
Just to be clear, the Dead Sea Scrolls version is more ancient than the Masoretic text, right?
Yes.
The Masoretic text didn't even come about until around 1000 AD, or am I forgetting?
Well, the manuscripts that we have of the Masoretic text are from 1000 AD.
Right.
The Masoretic text itself was developed in about the 700s AD, but it was based on manuscripts that were much older. So, for instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are manuscripts of certain books of the Hebrew Bible, as it were, that are almost identical to the Masoretic text. So that form of text is very ancient. But there are more ancient forms, and at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, there's a whole bunch of different forms. There's stuff that's like the Masoretic text, there's stuff that's like the Septuagint, there's stuff that's like the Samaritan version, and so on.
But the main thing that I just wanted to make sure in my mind is, it's not that the Dead Sea Scroll would have added something here to what the Masoretic text has. It's because the Masoretic text came hundreds of years later than this document that would indicate that something was left out of it.
Well, the oldest copies of Samuel that we have are more in line with the Septuagint, like the Dead Sea Scrolls version. Is like the Septuagint, and it has more in it. And the Masoretic text has missing stuff. And so the weight of evidence does certainly lean to the idea that the reading that we are about to read from the Dead Sea Scrolls copy and there are multiple copies, but from the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of this section, is more original than what is in the Masoretic text.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this is verse 22. So again, this is Elkanah, he went up to go make the yearly sacrifice. Then it says in verse 22, but Hannah did not go up, and she told her husband, not until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him to appear before Yahweh and to stay before ... and I will dedicate him as a Nazarite forever, all the days of ... Okay. So that's the idea. She will dedicate him as a Nazarite forever. Now, of course, even without that Dead Sea Scroll fragment, still people understood, oh, well, it sure looks like Samson is a Nazarite because of the idea that he is supposed to have his hair long for his whole life. He's not supposed to have a razor pass on his head, as it were. Now, this one does not have all the elements there, as we find in Numbers 6 or in Judges 13. But it is quite interesting how Hannah is weeping and how Eli thinks that she's drunk. And only after she confirms, I have not drank wine nor beer, the same terms that show up in Judges 13, and he says, okay, good. Only then is she given the blessing. And so there is an abstaining from wine and beer that is mentioned, although it's not given as a command, like abstain from wine and beer for this whole time or whatever. But perhaps there was no need for a command because she's saying, look, that isn't at all what this is about. I'm just pouring forth my heart. But she's dedicating him as a Nazarite, and the element of abstaining was with her. Abstaining from wine and beer, that element was with her, not with Samuel. With Samuel, the only element referenced is the hair. So these are the three main passages in the Protestant canon and in the Rabbinic canon concerning Nazarites. And it's really interesting when looking at them together, certain things kind of emerge. First, there are three main restrictions tied to Nazarites, as we've already talked about. But what's interesting is that in the cases where a parent, and in both times it's a mother who actually was childless, when a mother is dedicating her child to be a Nazarite, two of the restrictions apply to her, and one of them applies to him. Now, it's really interesting because, remember, in number 6, an individual consecrates themselves, and they grow their long hair, and the hair is what is offered on the altar. So the person consecrated in all instances, the person who is as an offering in all instances, is the one who has the long hair. That's in Samuel, that's in Judges, and that's in Numbers. Whereas the one offering, even if it's the same individual in number 6, for instance, the one offering abstains from grape products. That's there in Judges 13. That's there in number 6. And there's an implied version of that in 1 Samuel. And the offerer, the person who offers either him or herself or their child, also abstains from uncleanness of some form. In Numbers 6, it's from contact with the dead. In Judges 13, it's from eating food that would defile. And then in 1 Samuel, there's no element of abstaining from things that would defile, so far as I am aware. maybe in reading the broader context, something would show up. I can't say for sure. Obviously, Hannah has a lot more to say, so I can't say if there's absolutely nothing there. There might be some sort of allusion to that idea, but I'm not aware of it, so I can't say one way or the other. So those elements, what do they reveal to us? Well, what they reveal is that Nazarites are actually an offering to God. And self-vowed Nazarites are also kind of an offer, and we'll specify that more. But first, on the point of offering, I want to read something from 1 Maccabees. So 1 Maccabees 3, verses 49 to 51 says this: "They also brought the vestments of the priesthood and the first fruits of the tithes, and they stirred up the Nazarites who had completed their days, and they cried aloud to heaven, saying, 'What shall we do with these? Where shall we take them? Your sanctuary is trampled down and profaned, and your priests mourn in humiliation.'" Okay, so this is really interesting, because here you have the people, when the temple is desecrated, when the sanctuary is trampled down and profaned, and they can't do any sort of temple services, it says that they brought out all these things, and they're like first fruits and tithes and vestments of priesthood, things that are dedicated, inanimate objects that are dedicated to the temple, and they brought them out, and Nazarites who had completed their days, and they said, "What shall we do with these? Where shall we take them?" That's really interesting, how Nazarites who have completed their days are classed with inanimate objects even that are offered to the temple. Now, it's interesting, because Josephus actually talks about this, about people offering Nazarites. Not just a Nazarite going and paying for their own sacrifices and all of that. Josephus talks about other people paying for the sacrifices of Nazarites, and that's, in a sense, them offering the Nazarite to the temple. Well, that's kind of interesting. That's also in rabbinic literature, the idea of offering a Nazarite. People, it records how people in Second Temple times would pay for the fees of another and, in a sense, offer them. And guess what? That's also in the book of Acts, where Paul went to pay for the fees for the Nazarite sacrifices. And, it just shows that it's a practice that is attested, where these Nazarites are considered to be offerings to the temple. So this is something very, very interesting. But in number 6, it's really interesting, because the Nazarite is not just the offering. The Nazarite is also the offerer. Because it says, the way that it puts it is, when either a man or a woman takes a special vow, to take a vow as a Nazarite, to separate himself to Yahweh. By the way, just so you know, this is an example of the masculine himself, when it can refer to either a man or a woman, because it's generic. It just said a man or a woman to separate himself. Okay, well, just to say, whenever you see he or him, it's not always indicative of a male. So what is interesting is that the two stipulations, other than abstaining from hair cutting, are actually connected to priestly restrictions. So, for example, abstaining from strong drink and wine, that whole idea in Numbers 6, this is actually based on a command for the priests. In Leviticus chapter 10, verse 9, verses 8 and 9 actually, it says, "Then Yahweh spoke to Aaron, 'Do not drink wine or strong drink, you and your sons with you, when you enter into the meeting tent, so that you do not die, which is a perpetual statute throughout your generations, as well as to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean.'" Okay, so there's to abstain from wine and strong drink. Ezekiel 44, verse 21, talking about the priests of Ezekiel's temple, says the same thing, abstaining from wine and strong drink. But it's interesting because the Nazarite, it goes beyond that. It takes what seems like a priestly command, and it says not even eating grapes or raisins. None of the produce of the grapevine, from the seed to the skin. So that's taking it and extending it further. Likewise, the idea that the priest is to not come in contact with the dead is really interesting. So this is in Leviticus 21, verses 1 to 3. It says, "Yahweh said to Moses, 'Say to the priests, the sons of Aaron, say to them, for a dead person, no priest is to defile himself among his people, except for his close relative who is near to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, and his virgin sister who is near to him, who has no husband. He may defile himself for her. He must not defile himself as a husband among his people, so as to profane himself.'" Now, and it goes on talking about other restrictions for the priest. Now notice, the priest is not supposed to defile himself for a dead body, but if it is his immediate relatives, then he is allowed to. With the Nazarite, it takes that same priestly command, but it extends it. It becomes more strict. He is not supposed to come in contact with the dead, and not even for his close relatives. No one else has that command other than the high priest. Referring to the high priest in Leviticus 21, verse 11, it says, "He must not go where there is any dead person. He must not defile himself, even for his father and his mother." Okay, so that's quite interesting. So this makes sense now when you understand that those two restrictions are to make the Nazarite a sort of priestly figure, whereas the growing of the hair is to make the Nazarite an offering. Now it makes sense why it is the case that when someone else dedicates another as a Nazarite, the dedicator takes on the priestly restrictions, such as the mother of Samson, no product of the grape, and no unclean things. And then Samson only was the offering, and so he had the long hair. And of course with Samuel had the long hair. It doesn't mention any other restrictions in relation to him. And then there is this kind of reference to the idea of Hannah not having wine and beer, even though it's not as direct and so on, but still there's this reference there. So that makes sense if we understand that the Nazarite is the offering if he's dedicated, but if he dedicates himself, he's the offering and the priestly figure. To kind of sum that up, the three restrictions upon the Nazarite as listed in Numbers 6 indicate that a Nazarite who dedicates himself is both a priest and an offering. In a sense, of course, he's not actually a Levitical priest. He's doing something which, at least for a time, makes him like a priest. And another thing that is quite interesting, the Nazarite vow, at the end, in number 6, the Nazarite actually, the way that it phrases it is not that he gives his hair to the priest and the priest puts it on the altar. It's that he puts his hair on the altar. Again, he or she. There is no other time of which I am aware when an individual other than a priest is permitted to do a ritual in which they interact with the altar.
Well, how does that work if the Nazarite isn't the one who offered themselves? One thing I've noticed is that in the other 2 examples of the mother dedicating the son, it was for life,
Exactly.
which meant that he would never offer his own hair.
Exactly. There was no finishing ritual to it.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Nazarite for life. So that's, a separate thing. But the Nazarite who devotes himself for a period of time, at the end of it, it comes to completion, and now he's no longer going to be a Nazarite. But his hair is offered on the altar, and he offers it. So he is both offered on the altar, and he himself offers himself on the altar. Now, the hair is a part of himself, and that's why I say he is offered on the altar, and he offers himself on the altar. Also, throughout the ancient world, someone's hair is a symbol of themselves. And it makes sense because it keeps on talking about his consecrated head, his consecrated hair, but he is the one who consecrated himself at the beginning of the chapter. So the hair is the symbol of himself, and it growing talks about, it symbolizes his increase or his growth of himself, his increase in glory throughout that period. A Nazarite who offers himself is the way for a non-priest to become as close to the sanctuary as they can. It is the holiest condition a non-priest can obtain. So this is a really interesting thing, and it does have a place in the antitypical system. There is reference to things that are very Nazarite-like in the New Testament. And, the most direct is actually with Paul. In Acts 18, verse 18, it says, Paul, after staying many more days in Corinth, said farewell to the brothers and sailed away from Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because he had made a vow. He had made a vow. Well, the only scriptural hair-related vow is the Nazarite vow, at the end of which one must cut off their hair. Now, what's so interesting is that here he cuts it off, but not in Jerusalem, not at the temple. He's a long ways away. He's in Gentile lands, in Cenchrea. This shows that the priestly system in which he was participating was not the Levitical priestly system. And yet, he is doing a Nazarite vow, and it's also informative in that it tells you that he is not cutting his hair during it. And at the end, he cut his hair. In other words, the antitypical observance of the Nazarite vow still includes literally not cutting one's hair, abstaining from the cutting of one's hair. Also interesting, in Luke 22, verse 18, at the end of the Last Supper, Jesus says, "For I tell you that from now on I will not drink the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." That's paralleled also in Matthew 26:29. Now, that's really interesting. Now, this part, it doesn't mention, he doesn't say about growing his hair long or anything like that. He doesn't say about not touching the unclean. However, pretty soon he's going to not touch the unclean. He's going to go into heaven. But it's interesting how he says he vows to abstain from drinking wine, drinking the fruit of the vine, until the kingdom comes. Now, this sounds sort of like a Nazarite vow. It's an element taken from a Nazarite vow, at least. Whether it's a full Nazarite vow or not, I couldn't say for sure. He's at least doing something which is in harmony with the priestly idea. Not necessarily the offering aspect, but the priestly aspect. And it's also interesting how he gives a period of time on it, until the kingdom of God comes, which might indicate that, a Nazarite might make a vow to be a Nazarite for a time, and not necessarily a set period of days, but maybe until a certain event. So these are some elements within the New Testament that have this sort of idea. John the Baptist, there are certain elements about him. It says in Luke chapter 1, verses 13 to 15, it says, "But the angel said to him," not him being John the Baptist, but him being Zechariah, John the Baptist's dad. "The angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son.'" Notice she's another barren woman, just like Hannah, just like Manoah's wife. So, she will bear you a son. You will name him John. Joy and gladness will come to you, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. Now, that's not quite a Nazarite vow, and there's nothing that we have through the life of John that would indicate that he was a Nazarite, but it's similar to it. I wanted to read it just because there's some sort of similarity, but there's also certainly difference. But the clear references to the Nazarite vow, of course, are the ones in number 6 and 1 Samuel chapter 1, Judges 13, and Acts 18:18. Those are the clearest. The one in Luke where Jesus abstains from the fruit of the vine sure looks something a lot like that. And I'm sure there are probably more texts out there with some information, whether they've been discovered or not. But anyway, we do have enough in the New Testament to show us that there is a such thing as a Nazarite vow in the antitypical system, and that it does include abstaining from hair cutting. And if the reference in Luke is to be taken as a Nazarite vow, then it also includes abstaining from the fruit of the vine. And the fact that he's abstaining from the fruit of the vine, rather than specifying wine, but produce of the vine, it does make one wonder if it really is dealing with a Nazarite vow type thing. Okay, so what does this mean in antitype? What's this about? Well, the part that I have come to understand a bit better in comparison with the other types of Nazarite vows, if you will, is the vow in which an individual consecrates themselves as a Nazarite. The other elements of someone consecrating another, I understand less, but there's still this element where it is possible for someone to consecrate another as a Nazarite. And the person doing the consecration would take on a priestly type role, and the other would take on an offering type role. What all that means in that type, we will see. But in number 6, the idea of someone dedicating themselves as a Nazarite is really interesting because that gives someone an option to become kind of like a priest even if they're not a priest. Now, the priesthood of Melchizedek is the priesthood of righteousness. And in order to be priests in this priesthood that our Heavenly Family is establishing, one must obtain righteousness. That is what is specified in the consecration of the priesthood rituals. And that's gone through in some of the early issues of the Silver Trumpet. However, what about someone who wants to be a priest but does not yet meet all the qualifications to be a priest? There are plenty of qualifications to be a priest in Leviticus 21. Nazarites did not have to meet all those qualifications. They just had to want to take a vow and abstain from 3 things. That's what it took to take a vow to be a Nazarite. And that enabled them to be something like a priest. Now, in the priesthood of Melchizedek, in order to be a priest, one must obtain righteousness. However, someone may consecrate themselves to God and become something like a priest. And that is, it's almost like a training to be a priest in a sense, because in the Melchizedek system and the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, priesthood is not determined by lineage and these other things. It's by righteousness and meeting other qualifications as well. But someone could consecrate themselves as a Nazarite, and then later, because of their Nazarite vow and in them learning the ways of holiness through that Nazarite vow, it may very well be the thing to bring them to the new birth and enable them to become a priest if that is their calling. And of course, Paul, in Romans, he says that he is a priest. Of course, in the antitypical system, he was a priest and he also took a Nazarite vow. So he could certainly do both. Now, as to the restrictions and what is to take place, there's more details on it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I was just wondering if I heard you right. Did you say, like, after he had taken that vow, then he became a priest? Or
no.
You're saying that while he was a priest, after he was justified,
yes,
then he still took that vow?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Although I was saying that someone in the antitypical system who does not qualify to be a priest could take a Nazarite vow.
Right, I got that.
Yeah. So there are, still how many more elements to this. I'm looking at the time though, and we've been on for almost 2 hours, and it might be kind of long to just go more into this. And what we could do is just continue this tonight, since our meeting tonight actually starts still within the Wave Sheaf Day. And for some people, and depending on your time zone, the whole meeting will be during Wave Sheaf Day still. What do you guys think of doing that? We'll like ending the meeting now and then continuing on tonight.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family before we close the meeting?
I will.
Oh,
okay.
you can.
Okay. Heavenly Family, thank you for Tada Le'emet. Thank you for truth. Thank you for just the enlightenment that you continue to shower upon us. And thank you for this fresh, new, ripe grain that we are partaking of today. We also thank you for the life of Christ, both literal and metaphorical. And I just want to ask that as we learn more about the truth, that it will change us and that we will see this wave sheaf manifested very soon to gather in the harvest of the 144,000 and beyond. So please be with each one of us as we continue to go about our days and bring us back together tonight to continue this very important and enlightening topic. We thank you in the name of Branch. Amen.
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 Amen.